So what actually happens when a massive, revolutionary ideology faces a full-blown crisis? You know, when those grand, sweeping theories of history just crash head-on into the messy, unpredictable realities of the real world? Well, it's an absolutely fascinating question. And today, in this explainer, we're going to dive into exactly how rigid political theories react and adapt when the historical ground literally shifts right beneath their feet.
Welcome to the explainer. Today we're tracking some really complex ideas about society, freedom, and human agency. We're going to map out the historical evolution of something called open Marxism, and we'll do it through the lens of one of its most marginalized, yet incredibly influential pioneers. We're literally looking under the hood of these ideas to see how they were shaped by a deeply turbulent 20th century. And just a quick note before we jump in, we're just tracing the history of these concepts here, not taking any political sides.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, the crisis of Marxism. Second, we meet Leo Kofler. Third, human consciousness and history. Fourth, critiquing late capitalism. Fifth, the progressive elite. And finally, open Marxism explained. Let's get going.
Section 1. The crisis of Marxism. A system at a crossroads.
So picture this. It's the mid-20th century, and traditional Marxist theory is really grappling with some massive historical failures. We're talking authoritarian Stalinism in the East and reformist compromises in the West. This crisis caused a huge, fundamental divide. On one side, you've got mechanistic Marxism. This was the dominant, super rigid view of the 1920s and 30s that essentially saw human history as this guaranteed, automatic scientific process. But pushing back against that was a brand new wave, humanist Marxism. These theorists looked at things and said, wait a minute, history isn't just an automatic machine on autopilot. It absolutely requires conscious, subjective human agency.
Moving on to Section 2. Meet Leo Kofler, the rebel thinker.
So who is Leo Kofler? He was an Austrian-German social philosopher. And he didn't just study these ideological crises, he lived them firsthand. Born way back in 1907 in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the guy's life was practically defined by escape. In 1938, he fled Austrian fascism, literally crossing the mountains into neutral Switzerland. Later on, hoping to build a brand new society, he moved to East Germany. But as you might guess, he clashed fiercely with the Stalinist state there. Facing imminent arrest, he had to flee again in 1950, this time to West Berlin. And this brilliantly illustrates his whole philosophy. His physical displacement perfectly mirrors his intellectual journey, a total, uncompromising rejection of extremes on all sides.
Because he constantly rejected these dominant systems, Kofler was famously described as, and I love this phrase, sitting between all chairs. He was, in a sense, intellectually homeless. He refused to conform to Western capitalist ideals, he rejected social democratic complacency, and he absolutely opposed Eastern Bloc Stalinism. But you know, sometimes being the ultimate outsider is exactly what gives you the clearest, most critical vantage point to see a system for what it really is.
That brings us to Section 3, Human Consciousness and History.
Now, Kofler's incredibly unique life experiences really pushed him to develop some fresh theoretical solutions to all this crisis. The biggest one? Socialist humanism. I know, it sounds like a lot of jargon, but at its core, this concept is all about human agency. Kofler passionately believed that, sure, history definitely has economic and structural processes, but it is absolutely not a predetermined natural phenomenon. We aren't just cogs in a machine. Our conscious, subjective actions are actually what shape history.
The crucial point here is captured perfectly in this one phrase. History is not made by consciousness, but through consciousness. Think about it for a second. Ideology and human thought, they aren't just invisible byproducts of the economy. They are the actual lens, the actual vehicle through which real change happens. Kofler basically completely revalued the power of human thought. He argued that your ideas and your choices are active, powerful ingredients that shape society.
All right, Section 4, critiquing late capitalism, the illusion of liberty.
Jumping ahead to 1960, Kofler turns his critical lens toward Western post-war society, the welfare state, and he writes this: "The world is nothing but useful, profit-oriented, otherwise it became empty and meaningless." It's a sharp observation. He's neutrally pointing out that bourgeois society had largely abandoned its historical claims to humanistic enlightenment, basically replacing genuine human development with sheer, raw economic utility. He actually described this condition as negative freedom. He argued that liberty had been shrunk down to mere market competition. The freedom to simply consume goods had completely replaced the freedom to realize higher human ideals. For Kofler, this illusion of individual freedom, the ability to just buy whatever you want, It actually masked how people were being integrated into a repressive system. Sure, it promoted comfort, absolutely, but it also bred profound political apathy and societal lethargy. It's kind of like an existential pain masked by prosperity. And honestly, that might sound a little familiar if you look at today's consumer culture.
Let's move to Section 5, the progressive elite.
So, if these traditional systems were just promoting apathy, who on earth was going to change things? Well, Kofler proposed something he called a progressive elite. And no, he didn't mean wealthy aristocrats or billionaires. He meant an amorphous, cross-class group of nonconformists. See, because the traditional organized workers' movement had historically failed to bring about the emancipation he was hoping for, Kofler started looking elsewhere, to students, dissident socialists, progressive Christians, and artists. What's wild is that he actually predicted the rise of these very individuals years before they would eventually form the massive New Left movements of the 1960s. Talk about being ahead of the curve.
Now, what's really interesting about this next slide is how sharply Kofler's view clashed with the most famous intellectuals of his day, folks like Theodor Adorno of the Frankfurt School. While Adorno looked at the modern world and basically fell into pessimistic fatalism, genuinely believing the working class was fully lost to consumerism, Kofler maintained this incredibly resilient category of hope. He absolutely refused to give up on human agency. He insisted that bridging these new social movements with traditional struggles was the only viable path forward.
And that brings us to Section 6, Open Marxism Explained. So, zooming out a bit, how did Kofler's core ideas about human agency actually evolve? Well, by the 1980s and 90s, other theorists started formalizing his approach into a much broader movement. As you can see from the 1992 book cover on screen, this culminated in volumes establishing Open Marxism. This was a direct response to structuralism and those new right socioeconomic shifts we saw in the late 20th century. It firmly rejected the highly academic, structuralist Marxism that had really dominated the 1970s.
So, what exactly are the core tenets of open Marxism? Let's unpack this. First up, it completely rejects structural determinism. That's the idea that society operates on these fixed, unbreakable scientific laws. Second, it focuses heavily on the fluid interaction between human beings and the structures they actually live within. Third, it views crisis not just as a disaster but as a space of contradiction, and crucially, opportunity. And finally, theory isn't just passive observation. It acts society's critical self-understanding. It keeps its categories fluid and entirely rejects the rigid, teleological closures of earlier interpretations.
These theorists specifically warned against what they called the danger in closure. The argument goes that any closed theory, one that just accepts dominant structures as unchangeable facts, well, it simply ends up chasing the tail of capitalism. It just describes what exists without ever analyzing the contradictions that could actually change it. Open Marxism, by contrast, seeks to retain a critical, adaptable perspective. It is always looking for the cracks in the foundation, those places where human agency can finally break through.
Which brings us to a final, provocative thought. We've explored how rigid theories can completely fall apart, and how thinkers like Kofler fought tooth and nail to keep the human element alive. So I want to leave you with this to ponder. In our modern era of rapid technological change of algorithms and massive global markets, is human consciousness still the ultimate driver of history? Or have the structures finally outpaced the subject? It's a massive, complex question about the balance between systemic structures and human agency. Thank you so much for learning with us today.